It's time to get hot and bothered in E2M2 Burning Bars. After the first map was as good as it was, it's a real shame this one had to backpedal so tremendously. It takes all the cheapness of the worst of the maps before and adds on just frankly lazy map design. I'm guessing it's supposed to be a prison of some kind with the bar doors, but it's basically just the same halls and rooms on repeat with enemies spammed out. Given they're all hit scanners and can shoot you somewhat around corners, it just leads to the map feeling like it's sucker punching you constantly. It's the one map I felt I had to save scum more than any other just because it seems like trial and error if you'll shoot them before they shoot you. The introduction to the more mechanical doors at the beginning is pretty cool, but that doesn't really matter for much when the rest of the map is such a chore getting through. You know something is a bad experience when a cool looking graphic is the best you can say about a map. At least the other worse ones had pretty good design. It's time to dodge the undodgeable in E2M5 Howling Hitscan. I gave it its name because it's another map that just seems to spam things out with hitscan enemies, which again feels very cheap and is a problem with some of these maps. Now I will give it credit for at least having some more variety of visuals. It's less burning bars and more dastardly duels, though not by much. I sort of see where it's going with this, prison cells just full of enemies, but that doesn't make it feel any less sucker punchy to have a room full of hit scanners who take walls as a suggestion. Like I said, it has a bit of variety with the bunker section, and the prison sections at least aren't just cheaply copy-paste, so I'll give it a bit of leniency based on that. There's also plenty of potions scattered around and pentagrams of things like good health to be found, so it's not like you're left with nothing. My complaint isn't so much that the map is meltingly hard, at least on medium difficulty, but that it feels like difficulty in a way that didn't have much thought put into it. It's time to hit the snooze alarm in E1M2 Sorcerous Snores. Fair warning, playing this map on Let's Party will probably make you want to rip your own hair out with how absurdly cheap everything feels. While I don't blame the map for enemy mechanics, I do blame it for putting witches in front of your face and spamming skeletons cheaply. Being hit scan and capable of hitting you kinda through corners, the map's placement certainly doesn't help this feeling, and it's easily the most frustrating part of the game. That being said, the map does at least offer hedge mazes, bedrooms, and dungeons, so aesthetically it shows off its variety over Wolf 3D. It even introduces a mild puzzle mechanic in the form of a safe with a combination being right next door just to show it off. It's only a shame that the actual combat aspect of the map is so frustratingly easy to die over and over again, even if you spam the fire button as fast as possible. It's time to get AI-generated vegetables in E2M8 Garden Gynoids. This map definitely has the most annoying use of turrets. I didn't know how to get past them other than quickly skipping across them hugged to the walls. There's very little else in the map other than a confusing cavern and hedge maze area below and a stone wall bunker later on that just felt like a little bit of filler to the exit. In case I wasn't being obvious enough, I really don't like this map as a whole. While no one element frustrates me more than many other maps, the worst being the turret room, it doesn't really have much to compensate for it. The whole map kinda felt like a slog to get through. Even the starter puzzle with blocks was very easy to accidentally screw up even if it was compensated by being at the start. For the penultimate map of this episode, it proved to be quite disappointing. It's time to fire blindly into E1M10 Dastardly Duels. This secret map follows the trend of many, mostly just having a pretty shallow gimmick, every enemy in the game being the gunslinger in different outfits. While I've seen worse gimmicky secret maps and it at least has some depth for map design, it feels more than any other map so far in Nightmare 3D that each area is there for filler and there are way too many of these guys in some rooms. One area is just straight up a gray metal looking texture and it's absolutely flooded with them. It feels very cheap with that many hit scanners. This game released not that long before Doom 2 and already has projectiles for the player's weapons, so I don't see why they couldn't have been used for some of the enemy attacks. As wide as an ocean but has the depth of a puddle is very much the name of the game in this map if I'm being honest. It's time for things to get really hot in E3M3 Frightening Flames. Probably the best way I can describe it is being a bit of a confusing labyrinth with the way it wraps around. Some of the use of textures like the dark textures and opening curtains as destructible walls are kind of neat, but it gets very repetitive. Given you have to go to the far end to get a key, go back to the start for another key, then the far end again, it seems like backtracking for the sake of filler. At least the ghosts provide some slight contrast from the demons and fire demons, both of which are very similar hit scan, but the map as a whole still feels like it kind of drags on longer than it should. Well, at least there was an orange cavern upstairs to add a bit of variety if nothing else. As a whole though, this map feels very much like it was used to pad out the episode rather than being anything special. It's time to face the creeper in E1M10 Spooky Encounter. This is honestly a disappointingly short map, not even a boss fight since you scriptedly lose immediately. The one interesting mechanic is basically a Dracula figure you have to lure to some elevators to block it so you can get through. Other than that, the other keys you need for crossing over are just behind secret doors you can find easily enough if you have any eye power. Admittedly, it's a pretty cool effect for the final area to be in black and white. Penelope's surrounded by crystals like they're imprisoning her, which is an interesting use for the sprite. It's only a shame the rest of the map is just such a nothing burger, to be honest. At the very least, it'd be nice to have some other enemies around. I guess it's meant to be a fake out more than anything else to make you think it's gonna be an actual fight. It's time to get a little explodey in E2M10 Perilous Plasma Core. There is somehow even less to this map than the first episode's finale, to be honest. It's literally just opening secret doors right at the start of the map to get all the keys and ID cards, just guarded by some random wheeled robots. The one upside it has is there's a plasma core you're supposed to destroy, even though it's just to destroy this objective and still not actually a boss fight. I almost feel I'm being harsh for judging this map this way since it's meant for the lore, but I'm judging it as a map, so it's very disappointing. At least it still had that cool remote door openers, and the plasma core itself is full of animations, even if some of them are just reused assets. Weirdly, the screen flashes red as you're damaging the plasma core, which can lead you to think you're taking damage, but nope, the plasma core cannot harm you. I suppose at least it doesn't have any of the frustrating elements, and it's over a lot quicker than the first episode's end map. It's time to face the hammer in E3M10 Revolting Rematch. So this is the ultimate boss map with the evil Hammerstein himself, finally a boss that can fight back. There's just one problem, the Hyper Blaster completely trivializes this fight. You get several floors full of ammo and health, and I didn't even have to resupply because I stun-locked him until he was completely dead. It's a bit anticlimactic that after all those dangers and deadly foes, the final boss is a complete pushover. Granted, if you give him the chance, he can actually do quite a bit of damage with his pistol, but there's no reason to really give him that opportunity. The ending is bittersweet, with Penelope saying there's something vague she has to do related to his genetic experiments, and they part ways. To be honest, I was very disappointed and felt they could have done so much more, maybe a projectile fight or something like that. It's time to get weird in E2M3 Bizarre Bunker. Unlike the previous map, this one doesn't feel cheap, but it does have a lot of destructible walls and secret doors, not all of which obvious and many of them necessary to complete the map. I'd overlook that, but sometimes it seems like it's inconsistent what's a destructible wall when one black blob can mean something completely different. It's not a complete condemnation of the map, of course, but it's something that sort of rubs me the wrong way since it can easily lead to you getting lost. On the plus side, it has some pretty decent map design with a combination of underground cavern and underground hideout to provide a little variety, even if it still overuses the gunslinger a bit too much. It also sort of likes to tease you, showing things behind obstacles like keys or other rooms that you need to get through so you'll have to work out how to get there. Ultimately, it's an alright map that didn't really irritate me too much, even if the lack of distinction at times I felt could have been better. It's time to come play with us in E1M4 Horrifying Halls. This one's more of a shrug than anything else, with mostly winding halls and one weirdly long zigzag to serve as mainly the new aspects of it. It does have a very interesting secret exit, mind you, involving blocking an elevator and introduces the Hyper Blaster, but that's about it. It's not bad by any means, it just has mostly things done before, save for some oddities like a scroll you only see the number sequence of once, so you'd better have remembered it. It's kind of interesting how despite the game operating on a rock, paper, scissors with the weapons, the blaster just straight up uniquely gets a rapid firing upgrade. Visual design continues to be Nitemare 3D's strength with things like televisions, sofa chairs, beds, dining tables, tombstones, etc. This map may not hit the highest highs, but at least it certainly doesn't hit the lowest lows either. It's a fine map. It's time to break windows in E3M4 Baneful Bricks. Probably the most memorable part of the map is having a key that requires precision aiming several destructive walls for a block puzzle. Other than that, it's mostly another long labyrinth, although that's not to say it doesn't have its more interesting elements like a sort of moonstone texture. To its credit, it hardly felt like a slog to get through, and maybe it's a symptom of the limitations of this blocky-style engine more than anything else. Perhaps one thing that doesn't help is when the maps rely heavily on one-block-long hallways that gave an almost claustrophobic feeling to everything. I think this kind of game engine, as I mentioned in Wolf 3D, works better with tight but moderately spacious rooms. Ultimately, this map feels solid and at least didn't feel like a chore to get through unlike the previous map, but it still leaves something to be desired. It's time to go mad scientist in E2M6 Deceptive Developments. The real noteworthy part of the map is stairs leading down to a room of gunslingers that will just instantly kill you and are impossible to beat. Of course, you're supposed to find a secret wall next to the stairs so you can go around them and pick them off from a small opening, hence Deceptive in the name. The rest of the map is more or less business as usual, a mix of hedge maze, cavern, wood and bunker, and stone wall for aesthetics, so there's some variety. Other than the one obvious case, the map doesn't really have any other cheap shots, thankfully, even if I'm not the biggest fan of the gunslingers in general. Once you get everything from the cavern and hedge maze, the rest of it goes by relatively quickly for the indoor sections of it. Ultimately, it's an alright map, even if it's sort of centered around a death trap with the rest of the map not being anything too special. It's time to get all robotic in E2M8 alarming automations. In terms of what I liked, it's a real blast in the past, with bull statues and turrets making a comeback, which was weirdly satisfying in a nostalgic kind of way. It also introduces ID card activated machines that open remote doors and shut off said turrets, which gives a nice science fiction sense to it. Sadly, it takes what I said about the previous map and ignores it, room full of those spongy on wheels robots which were very hard trying to put down without taking tons of damage. Interestingly though, the crypt area with the bull statues is also loaded with destructible block puzzles, which thankfully weren't too hard to figure out, but still should quick save just in case. As a whole, I'd say the map was actually pretty good, combining old and new elements in a pretty satisfying way. It's only a shame that the final stretch with that load of robots kinda soured it, supplies or no supplies to compensate for it. It's better the one you know in E3M2 Dire Devils. It introduces a new enemy that I honestly can't tell if it's a fire demon or an alien or something, which funny enough is how I'd describe Doom 2's Archvile. Completely immune to the wand, which could either mean it's not supernatural or just it's protected from magic. The map itself just seems too winding for its own good, especially in the main areas, giving me some Horrifying Halls vibes. Notably, I'm surprised it took until now to have an enemy in the exit room, something its contemporary Wolf 3D did quite often. Visually, it's not the most distinguished, but it at least has visual wall variety like Faded Bricks, which to its credit, it's always had the edge over Wolf 3D when it comes to. I certainly don't dislike this map, the fire demons I'm going to call them are a reasonable addition, but I just wish it wasn't so long-winded at times and was a bit tighter. It's time to get unnerved in E3M1 Unsettling Underworld. It seems this game takes a page from Doom's book and just has the third episode straight up take place in hell. It isn't called hell, just some other dimension, but the fire and demon imagery sure isn't painting a picture of heaven. On the plus side, this episode wastes no time in getting you your stuff back because it's right at the beginning, even if the reason you can't just leave is a little contrived. For the most part, the ghosts and demons are fair, even if the red demon at the end feels about as cheap as the witches early in the game. I find it interesting how, despite it being implied to be hell, there are crypts as if you can die in hell or something of that nature. There really isn't too much to say about it apart from that. It's a serviceable starter map that sets you up for things to come, and it has fairly catchy music too. It's time to get stared at in E3M8 Frightful Faces. This map mostly just seems like it's recycling the previous one's concepts, albeit with a couple of twists that in some ways are more irritating overall. For example, instead of a fire demon simply blocking a door, it walks in a line and you have to time it properly, which doesn't seem creative. There's some fire hazards, but far less intelligently placed, and it just seems like a shot in the dark if you'll get the right wall at the beginning. The rest of the map is the same old labyrinths and secret doors and push blocks you've likely done enough times to be tired of by now. Perhaps this map is unfortunately placed more than anything else, since the previous map had the same ideas but implemented them better in my opinion. This map then just becomes awkward. I'm not going to say it's the worst, of course, but it feels fairly disappointing. It's time to stir things up in E3M5 Agonizing Ashes. I feel like I'm going to be a broken record if I just mention one block wide labyrinths with each map, so I'll just say at least there's some twists on it. It's very much a mixed bag though, because there's an abundance of red devils seemingly to cheap shot you and hidden doors everywhere, though that's mitigated by the eye detecting them. I have to say though, the destructible wall pushable block combo kind of wore out its luster. It's becoming expected now. Probably the most unique part of the map is that sort of melting wall texture that looks like it came from those psychedelic media players you used to see everywhere. I don't entirely blame David Gray, he was probably running out of unique ways to use the engine, but maybe it showcases how he could have made it a bit closer to Doom for more creative flexibility. It's time to jump through hedges in E1M8 Mutating Mazes. This map has some intricate block puzzles, like having to shoot a destructible wall from behind to move a tombstone, which is pretty cool. The downside is it's very easy to get pushable things stuck, so it definitely makes you want to be careful about where you quick save. Apart from that, the main new thing about the map is having another living statue, which mechanically feels the same but is a rabbit rather than a bull, so that's kinda neat. Like Gruesome Graveyard, this mostly takes place outside, this one even more so since only the final stretch and one small branch take place indoors, which is an interesting contrast. I wish the puzzles weren't so easy to permanently botch, but at least the map is otherwise fine, and the use of destructible walls and push blocks makes for some creative puzzles. It's time to go grave robbing and E2M4 Concealed Coffins. This is certainly a very lengthy map and very heavy on the block puzzles, thankfully none of which I felt I could easily fail them. Probably the most noteworthy is going upstairs and just having a cavernous room with skeletons absolutely everywhere. Thankfully it's not just cavernous, it has some crypt, hedge maze, and bunker sections, with the hedge maze predictably just full of rabbit statues, which seems to be a favorite recently, weirdly not so much the bull ones. One interesting thing is the exit is much larger and has multiple portals, but they all just exit so it's aesthetic, not affecting mechanics at all. I hadn't really been using the eye power to project a map that much before, but this map actually made it fairly easy to get lost in, so admittedly it's a nice function. I wasn't the biggest fan of how easy it could be to get lost or how easy it could be to miss some of the puzzles, but I really never got to the point that I needed a walkthrough or anything, so it's fine. It's time to break out the holy vacuum cleaner in E3M6 Devilish Dust. This map is certainly a case of being careful what you wish for because it's unique alright, not necessarily in good ways. For starters, it actually introduces hazard floors you have to walk through and take damage, probably not one of the ideas from Doom I would have gone for. The map also starts out completely surrounded by locked doors and you have to move a specific tombstone to get around it, which isn't so bad. However, it puts a spin on the destructible block thing by having a ghost blocking a door and is far enough away that you have to chip away at it while also being pixel precise. Of course, it also takes the Wolf 3D tactic of crevices with enemies in them, which is potentially worse here because the shooting through corners thing. Ultimately, it's more original, but it's also a very mixed bag. It's time to cringe at the machine in E2M7 Repulsive Robots. As you probably guessed, the main thing about the map is introducing robots, one Roomba-looking one that's very tanky and a humanoid one that's actually significantly weaker. It also reintroduces the ID cards affecting elevators, meaning you need both ID cards to access all floors, which actually kind of stumped me at first. The map keeps visual variety with cavern, wood, stone, and metal walls, and nicely brings back the attic look, which I was kind of glad to see make a slight comeback. Other than the on wheels one just being ridiculously beefy and having an obvious relative weakness to the blaster, the robots are mostly like any other Hitscan enemy with a new skin. At least they aren't really spammed out, probably because that health pool that they have would make it ridiculous, not to mention their size. Ultimately, I wouldn't say it's a great map, but it introduces a couple of new enemy types and looks visually appealing for the most part. It's time to pay respects to E1M6 Gruesome Graveyard. This map introduces a new enemy in the form of statues that unexpectedly come to life and could potentially ambush you, but thankfully are only melee attackers. The map itself mostly takes place in a dungeon area with some indoor areas to provide some contrast, which is certainly a change of pace. There's a part where you're navigating shrubbery and tombstones under fire that is a little annoying, but thankfully doesn't overstay its welcome. Being mostly in a dungeon area means it's not the most visually varied, but it still looks just fine, and if you didn't know some tombstones could be pushed, this block puzzle might stun you a bit. Ultimately, the map is mostly basing itself around the surprise statue mechanic, and it's a decent one, both melee and being visible with the eyes to keep it from feeling cheap. It's time to get out of this hell in E3M9 Exalted Escape. Basically, this is the penultimate map centered mostly around what looks like a massive church with a small labyrinth outside. Perhaps fittingly, it throws everything at you with the harsher red devils and fire demons to hit you fairly hard. Admittedly, it was very cathartic seeing the mansion and then heading out of the dimension underground, then going back through the mirror in the black and white world to finally get back to square one. While there isn't too much to the map complexity-wise, it more than makes up for it in terms of sheer enemy difficulty since they can end you fairly quickly. Along with the music used, there's just a feel-good moment because you know you're actually approaching the end of all of this. I'm probably biased in thinking this, but the map actually succeeds in the intended mood and doesn't overstay its welcome. It's time to go exploring in E2M1 Creepy Caverns. Interestingly, this may be the lengthiest of the maps so far, or at least it kinda feels like it. It's also not afraid to dump a ton of enemies on you at once, in this case a lot of rabbit statues guarding a key. Like the first episode, you start out without a gun, but that changes quickly enough and uniquely requires 2 ID cards, one for an elevator at the start. It even has sliding locked doors and a new cavern aesthetic, as well as a new type of wooden wall, which is just different enough to make it feel pretty refreshing. It doesn't really introduce any new enemies or weapons, but is at least a good enough map to get through on its own terms. At the very least, it's more than competent enough to stand against the Episode 1 maps and does a decent enough job laying the groundwork for what's to come. It's time to enter, if you dare, into E1M1 Frightening Foyer. It's kind of funny that the engine is so similar to Wolf 3D, since like that game, its map lacks names, so I'm just making them up, in this case a foyer being like an entrance. For the most part, it does a decent job settling you in by having mostly melee enemies apart from some very threatening guys with guns. Interestingly, it starts you out with literally no way to defend yourself, even if you find a blaster straight away, which makes this slightly redundant. While it does show stair and elevators, locked doors, and the exit gate, it otherwise avoids puzzles, which makes sense being the first map. It also has a good amount of visual variety on display with things like a kitchen, dining rooms, living rooms, and wooden back rooms. While limited in a similar way to Wolf 3D, it manages to be so much more visually varied and pleasing, and it's a strong first map. It's time to get to oil refinery in E3M7 Brisk Brimstone. It's bizarre, I almost feel like I should absolutely despise this map, but weirdly I have to applaud it for actually being different. It starts out with a maze of fire, mostly avoidable but a few mandatory sections, but at least it uniquely requires you to watch your step. Then you have to lure fire demons over to doors with one you also have to block with a tombstone, which kind of works for the more puzzle vibes of this game. Then there's the expected secret doors and seemingly exclusively fire demons, and I'm not sure how to feel about this map. Just to avoid being overly cynical, I think I'm actually going to lean in a more positive light towards the map. It may be potentially annoying in its elements, but I actually thought it was a lot more original and engaging than the majority of the maps, and in better ways than the previous map, which is refreshing after so many bland ones. It's time to cut loose an E1M9 Dangerous Dance Party! This map definitely goes off the rails, more so than any of the other maps so far, really having some different ways to solve things. It'll have secret doors as door frames and coaxing enemies away from places. As the map name suggests, the highlight is a room where your weapons are jammed and you funnily have to use a radio's dance music to get enemies blocking a door to dance out of your way. I'm not a fan of the Frankenstein's Bride Witch being everywhere because they hit so hard, but that's just a personal preference and the map is mostly fun to play through. Having a chalkboard that doesn't work with a secret door nearby with a scroll was actually kind of clever. In general, this map will play with your expectations, and I can respect its out-of-the-box thinking, even if I don't think that every single element is the most fun. It's time to get hecking hexed in E1M3 Wicked Witchcraft. This map is drastically better than the previous one for difficulty fairness, having more witches but also compensating with a magic wand that's very strong on them and can actually stun them effectively. Skeletons likewise are reined heavily in, even the hedge mazes have a very manageable number of them. The most you could actually criticize really is potentially fudging an introduced block puzzle and being permanently stuck, but it's a very easy puzzle, so not really an issue for most. In addition to the wand, you also get the silver pistol at the map's end, though by then the map's beaten aside from any stray enemies you may have missed. Still, the possibility of actually having an instant hit-scan weapon of your own is pretty nice, and the map even adds new visual themes like attics, all around just a huge improvement. It's time to light a candle in E1M7 Blistering Blackout. For being a Wolf 3DS game with no brightness values, I find it really cool that this map attempts to imitate a Blackout where everything goes dark. Basically, the walls are darkened and the floor and ceiling color is black, which leaves objects and actors fully bright, but still interesting since you have to fix a fuse box. It also sort of introduces two new enemies, one that's basically a turret that's more of a hazard, and a new witch that looks like the bride of Frankenstein's monster. The latter seems to hit all the harder than a regular witch, which is probably why there's so many pentagram power-ups around to bring you back to full health or ammo. Ultimately, this map may be centered around a gimmick, but it's one I actually think is very enjoyable and proves you can do some pretty interesting things with a Wolf 3D clone. It's time to sum up this three-dimensional dreams. To be honest, far too much of the game feels like filler. Like many, the first episode is definitely the most memorable, even if it still didn't have all golden moments. Perhaps the Wolfenstein 3DS limitations didn't help, but it's still weird that it had such a weak boss game, only having one real boss that can be railroaded insanely easily. On the other hand, the game does have its charms and has genuinely inventive puzzles and moments given the kind of engine it's on. The better of the maps make interesting use of it to create unexpected situations that have to be navigated around, like remote accessing doors and turrets. It's only a shame that there are some strange issues, not just many maps being less than originally designed, but some just feeling cheap with some quirks of the enemy AI. Still, you can do a lot worse, and at least it's generally engaging enough to keep from being boring.